Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us for the NREL LA100 study. Looks like some folks are still joining, so we'll go ahead and just sort of go through some intros and announcements. My name is Pete Eberly. I'm with the Northern Chapter of the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, otherwise known as CRES. For those of you who are new, CRES and its local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that accelerate the adoption of all forms of renewable energy, energy efficiency, high performance building, energy storage, and other emerging technologies that will help drive Colorado to 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, CRES is a statewide, nonpartisan 501c3 not-for-profit that is supported by our sustaining members as well as donations from our community. Before we get started, I do have a couple quick announcements on upcoming events. And I will send out an email to all registrants with links for this, so you don't need to jot them down. On Thursday, August 19th at 6 p.m., our Metro Denver chapter will host Mapping Inequality, the Relationships Between Redlining and Climate Justice with Ladale Windling and Robert K. Nelson. On Tuesday, August 24th at 7 p.m., the Northern chapter will feature a renewable energy update from Platte River Power Authority, PRPA. They will discuss their current renewable energy projects, their 2020 Integrated Resource Plan update, the Western Energy Imbalance Market, their Distributed Energy Resource Strategy Framework, and next steps as they move towards their goal of a non-carbon generating portfolio by 2030. Additionally, I want to thank our Northern Colorado business members that include Sandbox Solar, Solaris Energy, Hooter Valley Rural Electric Association, PRPA, and our newest business member, Benchmark Electrical Solutions, who provides commercial solar PV and energy solutions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jaquelin Cochran. Jaquelin is the director of the Grid Planning and Analysis Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where she has worked for 12 years. Dr. Cochran's work has focused on the evolution of the power grid with high deployment of renewable energy. She recently led the LA100 Renewable Energy Study, as well as a portfolio of analyses about India's power system. Before joining NREL, Dr. Cochran was an assistant professor of natural resource management at Kemet University in Almaty, Kazakhstan. She also served in the Peace Corps as a volunteer for 2 years with the Polish Foundation for Energy Efficiency in Krakow. She holds a PhD and an MA from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California at Berkeley, as well as a BA from Pomona College. So Jaquelin, off to you.
So as Peter mentioned, I'm going to be presenting our Los Angeles, like how Los Angeles can achieve 100% renewable energy. And the study is, we call it LA100, and what this might mean for other locations. So first, a little bit of context for those who are unfamiliar with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. That's the utility of the Los Angeles. It's the nation's largest municipal utility. They have over 4 million residents, and they're over 100 years old. They have fantastic transmission to help bring in renewable energy from other locations in the West, including the Northwest, wind from the Northwest and the Rocky Mountains, solar from the Southwest, geothermal. And while LADWP is electrically connected to the rest of the West in its power system planning and day-to-day operations, LADWP acts like an island, making sure it is always self-sufficient in supplying its own demand for electricity, no matter what else is happening in the West. So this makes achieving 100% renewable energy target especially difficult. We model the system as an island. Although electrically connected, when we look at power flow, in terms of like all the balancing resources, everything that we look at and how they can maintain 100% renewable energy at all times, this is done with their own resources. So great location, but an island. The other aspect of the study that I want to flag at the beginning is our fantastic advisory group. They really made the study. We had representatives from neighborhood groups, business, key business groups like LAX or the school district. We had academics, other local utilities. They were just so fantastic. Environmental groups. They helped shape the study and provided feedback all the time, always making sure that this study is grounded in the questions that the community, and here I really mean community stakeholders, right? These are not, most of them are not power system experts, and helping walk through what are the issues to them and from our perspective and from their perspective about getting to 100% renewable energy. So they were the best part of the study. So now on to the study. When we're thinking about how to decarbonize power systems around the world, the LA100 study addresses many questions that you might have about how a utility or a country could transition to 100% renewable energy. So for example, as more people adopt efficient technologies for their homes or electric vehicles, and as the climate gets hotter, how might that change total demand for electricity? And how can the utility supply this demand with renewable energy? How much solar might customers add to their rooftops? How can cities make sure that their 100% renewable power systems stay reliable under extreme events like fires and heat waves? And what about the impacts on jobs, the local economy, air quality, health, and environmental justice? And of course, what might all of this cost? To answer some of these questions, the LA100 study uses scenarios. Each scenario represents one pathway to 100% renewable energy future. And comparing the scenarios, which I'll do towards the end of this, helps illuminate the trade-offs of different choices that the community makes and what it means to be 100% renewable energy, what qualifies, for example. So one difference among our scenarios is on the demand side, on the customer side. So as customers electrify their cars and their appliances in their homes, such as for cooking and heating, and as I mentioned, as they adopt more efficient technologies, how does their demand for electricity change? Will any of this demand for electricity be flexible, such as being able to charge their cars when the sun is shining? The scenarios also vary based on how the renewable energy target is defined, how quickly that target is met, and how easy or not it is to build transmission. So I will talk mostly, use the high electricity projections and talk about the four scenarios on the right, where SB100 on the upper left reflects current California legislation, including that 10% of electricity can be offset by renewable electricity credits. So you'll see in this scenario that natural gas stays online. In the upper right, we have early and no biofuels. This scenario reflects an earlier target, 2035, compared to 2045 for the other scenarios. And this scenario does not allow the use of biofuels out of concerns about sustainability. And the bottom two are variations on whether transmission is feasible or not, or easier, I should say. In this slide reflects the detail that goes in the study. Each box represents a different modeling group, and the defining feature of the study is for the first time at NREL, we integrated all these different modeling teams using common sets of data and assumptions across everything to really understand the relationships across all these different aspects of how you transition to a 100% power system. So on the upper left, we have different bottom-up projections of buildings, electricity demand, electric vehicles. And we look at this from a distribution perspective, from a bulk power perspective, from economics analysis, and so forth. This might be a little spotty, but here I want to show we're zooming in on the city of Los Angeles and the LADWP territory, and we're looking at every premise in the city and what the demand at those premises are. And so first we're looking just at electric vehicles. We know in 2045 there's going to be a lot more electric vehicles on the load, and we want to know when and where that vehicle charging takes place. And so the height of these bars reflects over time. There's over a day, for example, of how that charging varies, so that all the customers can still meet their transportation needs. And we layer onto this all the other sources of electricity demand for heating, cooling, hot water heating, plug loads, you name it. We have all this detail so that we know when this is happening, where it's happening, and we know that the end use of this electricity demand so that we can back out how much of this could be flexible and available for demand response. So a lot of detail in the study. Sorry. Okay, so let's turn now to results. First, I'm going to talk about the future customer, what's their demand for electricity, based on this bottom-up modeling, and how much might they self-supply their own electricity with rooftop solar. Then I will describe how the scenarios take different paths to 100% renewable energy. I'll provide a high-level comparison of environmental benefits and how the scenarios vary based on that. And then finally, I'll mention some social and economic impacts. So let's start with the customer. In this figure, we can see that the contribution to peak demand from residential and commercial buildings in the orange and green colors could remain fairly flat through 2045. So the growth due to electrification of end uses, so like for cooking and water heating, for example, is offset by improvements to energy efficiency. So the main cause for the increase in peak demand is due to the growth in electric vehicles, which is represented in the figure in blue. One other point to illustrate, today in LA, the peak demand for electricity occurs in the afternoon. In the future, the timing of that peak demand varies highly based on where we assume electric vehicle charging can occur. So in the scenarios that assume more workplace charging, that the chargers are located at workplaces, the peak demand, that's the high scenario, the peak demand occurs earlier. Now this is even before we apply any demand response, but it shifts to earlier in the day. And the scenario that assumes almost no workplace charging, that almost all of it is residential, assumes a 7 p.m., ends up having a 7 p.m. Peak demand because so much of that charging takes place in the evening once folks come home. So this point illustrates the value of having flexibility on where that vehicle charging can take place and having access to the chargers in the locations where people leave their cars during the day. Next, let's turn to customer demand for rooftop solar. Our study illustrates a dramatic growth in rooftop solar. The study suggests that most customers would find it economic to have their own rooftop solar, whether it's on their roofs or whether it's like a community solar that's ground mount. Not everyone will buy solar, but we still expect a strong growth to occur from 6% of single-family homes today to 22 to 38% of these homes in the future, depending on the scenario. Our study also identifies locations that could support community-owned solar so that residents of multifamily buildings can own solar too. LADWP needs to anticipate how much of this growth could occur on the rooftops because this affects what LADWP would need to build to maintain its 100% goals. So how does LADWP supply all this demand with renewable energy? In all scenarios, across all scenarios, wind and solar provide 69 to 87% of future electricity demand. That means for LA, all roads to 90% renewable energy are very similar. The pathways diverge going from 90 to 100% renewable energy. This last 10% is what is needed for reliability during periods of very low wind and solar, extremely high demand, and unplanned events like transmission outages, or maybe even a weather event that we haven't experienced yet. To meet this last 10%, the study builds new local power plants with storable renewable fuels to maintain reliability. So how do the scenarios compare in meeting this last 10%? This chart shows the mix of technologies that gets built in order to maintain a reliable power system. Starting on the left, the colors show which types of power plants LADWP has today. Purple represents natural gas, the pinks different types of storage, the yellows are solar technologies, the blue is wind, and the red at the very bottom is nuclear. The other 4 columns represent what is built in each scenario by 2045. And while there's more in common across the scenarios than differences, the scenarios do vary based on what fuel is used in these local power plants. So the dark green represents a combustion turbine with a purchased fuel, which today is likely biofuels from dairy farms, but in the future could be fuels from renewable electricity like green hydrogen. The light green represents a fuel that LADWP would produce from 100% renewable electricity. The light green allows LADWP to get started today on supplying its own clean fuel, even before it's available for purchase from gas suppliers. The light green comes at a cost, though. Producing hydrogen rather than buying commercially available renewable fuels like biofuels today, and we assume by 2045 is hydrogen, adds 20% to cumulative cost in the LA100 study. Finally, the SB100 scenario does continue to use natural gas and purple for meeting the last 10% based on how that scenario target is defined. So that's an overview of that final 2045 endpoint, but how do we get to that point? It's interesting to walk through an example scenario, and I will choose the one that meets the target earliest, the 2035 scenario that doesn't allow any biofuels. We start in 2020 with a focus on just a few of the renewable technologies. Today, LADWP generates close to half of its electricity from renewable and zero carbon fuels, including hydropower and nuclear. In 2020, customers owned 340 megawatts of solar on their roofs. And LADWP had solar, wind, storage, and some geothermal. The chart on the right shows the overall mix of technologies in LADWP's portfolio today. Same colors as I just walked through. Now let's advance 5 years to 2025. In these 5 years, under this scenario, customers doubled their solar, but LADWP significantly adds, not advancing, solar co-located with batteries and wind. And wind, plus some standalone solar, geothermal, and batteries. So collectively, all this new generation would allow LADWP to generate 90% of its electricity using clean fuels. This is in 2025. So now let's step ahead another 5 years. By 2030, the pace of customer solar adoption has more than tripled. And for LADWP to move from 90 to 98% clean generation, it adds some solar co-located with batteries. It skips standalone solar, which doesn't have as much value to LADWP, and mostly adds wind and geothermal power plants to help meet times when solar generation is low or when demand is especially high. And finally, in 2035, the scenario meets its 100% clean energy target. Customers have added solar during these 5 years. LADWP has added solar, wind, and batteries to help meet the growing electricity demand, which, remember, that is also increasing at the same time that they are making this 100% renewable. but primarily to meet this last 2%, going from 98 to 100% renewable energy, and to keep the lights on when unexpected events occur, so events that might not even happen in a given year. LADWP has replaced its natural gas plants with power plants that run on LADWP produced hydrogen, which are needed infrequently. So one thing that we learned from this study is that identifying alternative options for firm in-basin capacity likely represents the largest opportunity to reduce the cost of the transition and points to the highest priorities for R&D. Hydrogen or other types of long duration storage, and extended multi-day demand response. So I want to just pause before going on. We did look at a lot of scenarios that didn't have any combustion turbines, but we tested this up and down for reliability, taking out transmission lines, assuming there are wildfire risks and so forth. And there were always, you could build out wind, solar, and batteries, but the vulnerabilities to things, to unexpected events, and therefore to lost load was always really high if we didn't have something located within the city. So having firm capacity outside the city, like they plan to have at their Intermountain Power Plant or with their nuclear, did not help them in these events where they were transmission vulnerable. So having something in the city that could come online and stay online for several days was really important. Now, demand response wasn't enough for this because we did assume a lot of traditional demand response where we're shifting, electric vehicle charging to earlier in the day. But here again, the role for extended demand response is something that can sustain LADWP through a multiple day event. So whether that's the transmission lines going down or it's a weird weather event like we saw in Texas, something where they could reliably assume customers would control their demand for electricity. Because of the unknowns to multiple day demand response, we did not assume that in the study, but that certainly could be a potential. So overall, we have seen how LA can achieve a reliable 100% renewable power system. And so let's turn now to some of the environmental and health benefits. The transition to 100% renewable energy and the electrification of vehicles, cooking, and heating provide significant greenhouse gas, air quality, and public health benefits. This figure shows the drop in greenhouse gas emissions across our set of 4 scenarios with high electrification of vehicles and building end uses. Starting on the left is in 2020. Across all scenarios, greenhouse gas emissions fall rapidly in 2025 in the power sector, represented in purple, due to the retirement of coal, and then fall further as natural gas is retired, such as in the early and no biofuel scenario. I don't know if my arrows are showing up. There we go. But the largest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions occur due to the adoption of electric vehicles, which is represented in green. The simultaneous decarbonization of the power system coupled with electrification in other sectors leads to the dramatic reductions in annual greenhouse gas emissions. And the LA100 study did not just look at greenhouse gas emissions. Sources that emit greenhouse gases also emit other air pollutants that impact air quality and public health. When it comes to these air quality and public health, the 2 pollutants that we care most about are fine particulate matter. These are tiny particles that are 3% as wide as a human hair and go deep into our lungs, and ozone, which is not emitted, but is formed in the atmosphere and can cause asthma. The locations where these pollutants are emitted and the way the air carries them elsewhere means they are not equally concentrated throughout the city. Those lucky enough to live on the coast have access to more fresh air compared to those inland. This is a map of what California uses it's a screening tool called CalEnviroScreen, which designates which census tracts suffer from socioeconomic health problems and are considered disadvantaged communities. And so we looked at this difference in air chemistry and how this differentially impacts different census tracts throughout the city. All scenarios in our study achieved 6 to 8% reduction in fine particulate matter concentrations in the air, mostly because of the electrification of light-duty vehicles and natural gas in homes and businesses. This number might seem small, but it is significant because it took the entire South Coast region 6 years to achieve a similar reduction, focusing on reducing emissions from just major sources. And our results are just for the city of LA, not the wider metro area, and only include some of these sources. So for example, we did not include electrification of medium and heavy duty trucks, which would also yield significant environmental benefits. The long-term breathing of fine particulate matter can lead to early death. Because of the 6 to 8% reduction in fine particulate matter concentration, there is a significant public health benefit, 1.5 million in health savings in just 2045 due to reduction in deaths, cardiovascular disease, and other diseases caused by this pollutant. So how do the scenarios compare in terms of benefits and costs? The combination of higher levels of energy efficiency, electrification, and flexibility in the timing of demand to align with renewable energy availability offers greater air quality and health benefits compared to alternative scenarios. And these scenarios help reduce per unit costs of electricity as we transition to renewable energy, because more electricity demand occurs during periods of plentiful sunshine and wind, and the cost of replacing our fossil fuel plants are spread across a larger demand for electricity. This underscores the importance of managing the rates of change, electrification and decarbonization, to avoid a spike in electricity bills that could place public pressure against electrification. The benefits to electrification are incredible, and it's that coupling of that with the power sector that gives such great results. One set of scenarios, as I mentioned earlier, meets the renewable target in 2035 rather than 2045 like the rest. This set of scenarios with the 2035 target results in higher costs because renewable energy technologies need to be adopted quickly when costs are higher than they will be 15 to 25 years from now. But this set of scenarios also has higher benefits, especially due to the faster reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And while all the scenarios lead to these large health benefits between now and 2045, the differences across our scenarios just within 2045 are pretty small, even for the scenarios that continue to use natural gas. This difference in what type of fuel is used to meet that last 10% or even 2%, natural gas versus a market purchase fuel versus an LADWP made hydrogen fuel, these differences affect cost. As I mentioned earlier, the self-produced fuel scenarios are the 20% increase in cost, but they provide almost no additional regional air quality or health benefits. This is because the plants that are needed to meet the weeks with low wind and solar availability and to be ready to start up when things go wrong are used much less than today, given that we meet most of our future electricity needs with wind, solar, and batteries. So relative to other sources of air pollution in the city, these plants, whether natural gas or biofuels or hydrogen, in 2045 have a very small impact on greenhouse gas emissions, ozone, and concentrations of fine particulate matter. So getting there has big benefits, but just within 2045, the differences are less significant. So finally, let's turn to economic impacts in LA. The transition could to 100% renewables could create thousands of clean energy jobs annually, but overall, the renewable investments alone are not anticipated to notably impact LA's economy. And that's because in LA, the power sector is a drop in the bucket relative to the overall size of the economy. And I'm not going to review this chart, but this chart you can find in our report, and it does walk through each of the scenarios and review some of the metrics associated with each in terms of what is the percentage of zero carbon generation, to account for the natural gas that still occurs. What are the costs of the scenarios? What are the total emissions and annual greenhouse gas emissions? And then what is the monetized emission cost of greenhouse gas emissions, the avoided health impacts, and the total jobs. And last but not least, our study shows that all communities will share in the benefits of the clean energy transition, but improving equity and participation and an outcome would require this to be integrated into the design of policies and programs. So for example, I've talked a lot about the importance of flexibility in the demands, so that your electric vehicle charging occurs during the day when the sun is shining. But for customers who don't have so much flexibility in their demand, maybe they don't have as good access to vehicle charging locations, some of our studies have shown, our other studies have shown the importance of having access to overnight vehicle charging. Similarly, as we are transitioning to electrifying different end uses in the home, how can we look at this electrification of different end uses and make sure that it doesn't increase energy burden on the folks in the community who already pay a significant share of their income towards energy needs? How can we do this in a way that responds to voices in the community so that they are participating well? So we looked at environmental justice in our study, but we didn't go into it as deeply as we would have liked. And so that leads us now to a part 2 of our study, which we are just getting going with, which is called LA100 Equity Strategies. And this is where we're going to be looking at different outcomes. So while the LA100 study looked at 100% renewable energy as its target and all the different pathways to get there, similarly, we're going to have community-driven outcomes that are defined by the community, and we're going to look at what are some pathways to those different outcomes. These are outcomes that would represent energy justice. So I'm really looking forward to this next phase of the work. So no matter which scenario, LA can get started now with many options that achieve significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which range in our scenarios from 76 to 99% by 2030. And you can dive into more of these findings at our website, LA100.org. There's a data viewer, that's what I'm showing you right here, for all the different parts of our study, so you can see some of the results and download data, as well as download our reports and look at some videos to help explain some of our findings. And with that, I will stop for questions.
Well, thanks, Jaquelin. Everyone, just so you know, I'll go ahead and make sure that link to the study is in the follow-up email. So let's jump into the questions. The first one from Nick. Are you modeling a reduction in hydro due to climate change?
No, we assumed hydro availability based on current. So we didn't look at hydro availability as one of the things we varied, but I am confident that with our having a local source of on-demand electricity with storeable fuels, that would help manage unexpected hydro years.
Okay, next question from Wade. In the 2035 with 100% renewable energy scenario, what is the design reliability criteria, e.g. 99.999 or less?
Yeah, we used industry standards. We used uh, different tools to look at reliability. A stochastic model, also PSLF. But one of the most interesting tools was just using production cost model to look at reliability, and that was what I was talking about, where we removed. We took different sort of N-1 and -2 contingencies, removed sections of transmission, and then ran the power system for the full year to see where the vulnerabilities are. So today, the system is most vulnerable in August. And that is because that's when August, September is when it's hottest and when the peak demand occurs. In the future, the vulnerabilities are a little more scattered later in the year. So, for example, late November week is one of our worst weeks. The sun, like in our weather year that we looked at, the solar generation is low that week, the wind is low, and there you have risks of the generation not being sufficient. And so with the production cost model, we can test out different combinations of transmission losses and see, do we lose load? And when does it occur? So that way it can change how folks plan for maintenance and really just thinking more broadly about measuring reliability over a broader set of weather and different weather events.
Great. Next question. Did the study consider NOx and SOx, nitrous oxide, sulfur oxide emissions from hydrogen fuel cells or reciprocating engines as opposed to hydrogen combustion turbines?
We looked at fuel cells as well, and we didn't assume any emissions from those. Yeah, fuel cells, one scenario built a few fuel cells, but overall they weren't as economically competitive in our model results. And then the NOx and SOx, I can't remember if we measured them or not. Maybe not.
Okay. For the early and no biofuels, costs are indeed very much higher. If the DOE storage shot program is successful, would that have a big effect on those numbers?
Yes, I imagine so. Yeah, because that was assuming, like, but you got to imagine that this study started in 2017, right? There's not a lot of talk about hydrogen. People don't even know if, like, you could get to 100% by 2045. Certainly no one was talking about 2035. And so, yeah, that scenario was really conservative because we wanted to respond, especially to a lot of the environmental community, environmental justice community, who really wanted to accelerate the clean energy transition. But we didn't want to make assumptions about what does the infrastructure look like in 2035, right? Are there pipes available to ship around hydrogen? So we took the most conservative estimate from a reliability LADWP perspective, but one that we think they could make work, which is, okay, they can buy the infrastructure they need to produce and store hydrogen. But yeah, absolutely, if we can find, I will not be surprised if there are far better technologies available in 2035, especially given the amount of focus that is now being turned to long duration storage, hydrogen, cross-sectorally, like, do we have a hydrogen economy that can support the infrastructure needed to ship hydrogen? So I'm excited.
Great. Do you have, or are you planning a study for Oregon, as they may have passed a 100% renewable energy bill by 2040 recently?
We aren't planning a study for Oregon. However, we are going to be working with the Department of Energy to consider how we can scale this type of effort. This LA100 study was large. It was first of its kind in terms of our models even evaluating 100% renewable energy and integrating all these models. But now we know that we've learned a lot from it, and we think we can do this faster and more efficiently and make simplifications where needed, and then look at this for other locations. So we don't have an Oregon study plan, but we are working with the Department of Energy to think about how we can work with different communities across the country to help them listen to them on what their goals are, and then how can we structure a similar study that's based on their goals and validate it.
Great. Will LA adopt one of the 4 scenarios or a hybrid? And do you know if they're favoring any of the particular scenarios?
They're going 2035. Yep. The mayor made an announcement in April that they were going to take a 2035 target. They aren't using biofuels, but they are assuming, well, they're starting their long-term planning process, be stakeholder driven, and it'll be starting later this year, probably in a month or so. So I don't know exactly what the composition will be. Likely it won't be the same as our scenario, but they are going forward with a fast timeline.
LA is a fairly big producer of oil and gas. I might have missed it, but is this accounted for in some way in the LA100?
Not in our, we looked at energy consumption for vehicles, for light duty vehicles, and for building end uses, and then the transition to electrification. So we do assume like vehicles run on gasoline, but we're not looking at the industrial sector. It's not a 100% kind of economy, net zero economy study. It's just a power system.
Okay, next question. You talked about demand response. What do you think can be done to correlate EV charging with actual renewable energy generation to avoid curtailment, i.e. encouraging night charging will make solar less valuable with higher penetrations?
Yeah, there's a lot of work now trying to look at what the infrastructure, I mean, again, like thinking now to our environmental justice part of the study, like what infrastructure would be needed to take advantage of, is it IT or faster Wi-Fi and certain tariffs, like what is needed to help take advantage of cost savings that could come from flexible, from demand response in a way that doesn't just give benefits to the folks who have a lot of flexibility in their lives compared to others. So it's a complicated question. I know a lot of research at NREL is looking at grid connected buildings, energy efficient buildings, and like how you can automate some of this. I think, taking the people out of the equation, or taking the people in the moment out of the equation in terms of demand for electricity would be helpful. We always want to keep people in the equation. I didn't mean to go that direction. And other autonomous technologies could also be a benefit. But yeah, like that's a rich area. There'll be a lot of work there. I don't have a ready solution.
Did the study make any assumptions about the nature of federal or state government policies over the upcoming 15 to 25 year period?
No, we assumed the current, at the time, let's turn back to 2018, 2019, under the policies in place there, we assumed that the tax credits phase out. We assumed any policies in place in 2019, in terms of 100% targets elsewhere in the West, we assumed those. We didn't assume anything in addition.
Okay, great. Do you consider import-export from 2 neighboring states? Can you describe transmission expansion in the most ambitious scenarios? And what is the trend of the retail tariff?
So yeah, we did. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we assumed LEDWP was self-sufficient. So what we built, like that for their day-to-day balancing, they were only accessing electricity that they have either built or put a PPA towards, and using transmission that they have rights to. They do. It is a good transmission system. Our scenario that had the most ambitious transmission assumed lower costs as a proxy for ease of getting permits and all of that. And also it assumed DC lines, some new DC lines that interconnected the different parts. If you recall, the cities, like that shaped. And so it assumed some DC lines within the city so that you could help move power around and be more efficient, have more efficient use of those resources. Whether that's hard though. I mean, we sat with the utility and looked at images of the streets and different transmission lines, and it's like, okay, look at this street. If you were to make it bigger, where are you actually going to put it? You've got the houses right here and there. So we know it'll be harder, but we did force in the study a more efficient use of the transmission that's there. So whether it's dynamic line ratings or more advanced technologies, we want to make the most. We want to squeeze all the efficiency we can out of their existing transmission.
Do you reduce the levelized cost of energy for fossil fuel generated power as the capacity factor for those generators go down with increased use of renewables? What implications do the decreases in capacity factor have for your cost estimates?
We did not look at debt. So our costs are kind of complicated to explain, but we looked at the cost of building and operating the power system from all sources that are built or operated starting in 2020 through 2045. So if there's a gas plant that's on today, we assume the cost of operating the plant, but we did not look at any debt associated with the plant.
Did you look at the impact of vehicle to grid or solar powered vehicles?
No, we didn't assume any special vehicle to grid or solar technologies. I forgot to mention, LADWP did its own rate analysis that did include all the debt. And they're looking at projections and rates that were surprisingly that were pretty good. We weren't sure what it was going to look like in terms of the cost of getting 100% renewable energy from a rate perspective, because it does include more cost. But in line with historical cost acceleration, especially with the high electrification scenarios. Having more demand for electricity helps reduce per unit cost.
Okay, relating to the West Coast and the wildfires, what happened if a lot of these assets burn down and cause these plants to be out of service? What would happen to the grid?
Not good things. That's a great, yeah. I mean, we didn't look at resiliency. I mean, there's a lot of questions. I mean, we looked at this wildfire issue, but we didn't look at other. I mean, there's many other follow-up questions that we could take looking at questions like that. But yeah, we didn't look at a major earthquake. We're just assuming that they're going to lose power and something huge, really huge.
Okay. How were the forward scenarios developed? Which participants drove those?
Yeah, they were developed by the advisory group. They reflected like, the different target. Again, when we started the scenarios, SB 100 wasn't even law. And so we modified the scenarios as soon as SB 100 became law. But, there we did have the faster target. And for that scenario, the community that wanted a faster target also wanted to see what it means to do it without biofuels. And the SB 100, we just kept to look like the legislation, which it's not a business as usual, but it does end up being more like what's the least they could do, so it's still an incredible change, but it would be, allowing the natural gas to stay on does save the cost of replacing those. And then the transmission related ones, so we had the one that was that was focused more on local solar, and to get there, that one assumed that you couldn't increase your transmission capacity beyond what was currently in the books. What was interesting about that is that it didn't actually, that scenario had one of the highest out of city builds of renewable energy. It didn't have the most, it was about tied with the 2035 scenario for the most development in city. But what we learned is that there's a lot of cost savings for building out of the city. It's about 40% cheaper to build in other parts of the Southwest because of just slightly better sunshine. Even if LA is great sunshine, other parts of the Southwest is even better. You get the economies of scale. You get enough space for tracking. All of those things combined, even with the limits on transmission, we still, on that scenario, maxed out what we could build out of the city. So that didn't end up being the scenario that we thought it was going to be at the beginning, which we thought was going to be, oh, how much can we go local and get there?
Okay. Where does small scale nuclear fit in?
We did not. The part of the stakeholders, the stakeholders did not want to look at smaller advanced nuclear reactors. So our scenarios did vary on how much they continued to use their existing share of Palo Verde nuclear plant in Arizona. So 2 of our scenarios retired it in 2045, and 2 of them didn't. But they're pretty small in terms of generation. In terms of capacity, it's very small. In terms of the share of generation, it's still pretty small when you account for all this increase in electricity demand that could occur from the vehicles. Yep, it didn't have a meaningful impact on results one way or the other. In the advanced nuclear, there's a lot of looking right now about what the market for the advanced nuclear reactors could be and what's the actual feasibility of when that could come online. So, if LA is looking at a 2035 target, they're going to end up building other commercially available fuels before advanced nuclear is available.
Okay, great. Any thoughts on how the results would look for a cold weather climate? Winter peaking due to electrification would seem to be a challenging problem.
Yeah, we were blessed with LA of having like it's summer peaking and there's a lot of solar, so those 2 go together. In other locations, I would still expect, solar and wind and batteries, that combination it's hard to beat. So even in colder climates, the ratios might vary. Maybe you have a little bit less. Maybe you're in a location that has nuclear, that wants to keep nuclear, or more hydro. But it's winter peaking, so you're always planning around that, and what are the contingencies associated with it.
Okay. Is there any benefit or detriment that a carbon tax would have on the LA100 goals?
We did not evaluate a carbon tax. So if I were to I mean, they all go, except for the SB100 scenario, they all go to zero carbon in the power system. So, but one goes faster. So maybe the other two would go a little. Here, I can say this. We had the scenario that I walked through, the 2035, I showed you how quickly it got to 90% clean energy by 2025. And then it goes 90 to 98 and then to 100. The other scenarios hit 90% zero carbon electricity in 2030. So close on hand. However, the two scenarios that are more transmission related or not transmission that have a 2045 target, those two plateaued at 90% for a full 10 years. So those didn't change, and that, you know, they grew a little bit because of the growing electricity demand, but there was no incentive for those scenarios to go any faster. So I would think for a carbon tax, those scenarios wouldn't just sit at 90% for 10 years, but that you'd still see the buildup of wind and solar. So we didn't look at it, so I probably shouldn't hedge. I mean, probably shouldn't speculate.
All right. In 2035, 100% renewable scenario, what is the capacity factor assumption?
The capacity factor is an output of our models, not an assumption about it. So we look at least cost development of all the assets, and then least cost generation. And so from there, we can then do the calculation of what the capacity factors are. And all of that information is on our website, LA100.org.
Okay, next question. Do you have any traction in getting the attention of representatives, I'm assuming elected officials and their staff? Is there a strong interest in this subject from legislatures, and what does NREL do to get in their ear?
Yeah, there is a lot. We've certainly been fielding a lot of questions from other locations who are also thinking about how to scale up their renewable energy or better involve local stakeholders. So we make time to talk to folks, but we're not advocacy. We're not even pushing 100% renewable energy, but we're here to help outline the methodologies that decision makers can take on understanding trade-offs.
Okay. Are there grants available to moderate and low income folks to install solar? I'm assuming in LA.
In LA, they definitely have low income solar programs. They have a community share solar program that people can buy into. I don't remember if it's a subsidy. I mean, it's an incentive of some kind.
Okay. The housing stock in LA is frankly not the best. Does that pose a major hurdle for reducing power consumption?
Well, if you're talking about losses, I'm not quite sure about that. If it's the housing is like the residents are about half in rentals, so that's a big difference compared to other locations where you might have a much higher home ownership, which allows you to do much more and take advantage of energy efficiency. So one of the big hurdles in LA is how you can get some of these electrification and efficiency goals with rentals.
This might be the last question, but I have one. Any possibility of a Colorado 100 study?
I would find it fascinating, but I have no idea.
Okay. The question I had is, have they considered, and I know it's still a little ways off, but it seems to be very close, particularly in Europe, but offshore floating wind, my understanding is, would have a much higher capacity factor.
Yeah, and we looked at that. The way our capacity expansion model works is we feed in assumptions about the availability of technologies. We have rich geospatial data on the resource availability. And then we have costs that we use our annual technology baseline cost projections that another part of NREL produces. And so we use the midpoints of those costs from the 2019 study, and offshore wind just was not getting built. So we ran a bunch of sensitivities on our results. And for example, if we assumed no transmission gets built and we assumed you don't have any combustion turbines available, then you get more offshore wind. But otherwise, it wasn't competitive. It's not direct. The good wind is north of LA. So we were trying to think, okay, could it go into, I'm trying to remember the nuclear plant, not San Onofre, but the one north. Could we feed the offshore wind into that transmission and bring it down? But it just wasn't. It's potential, but just based on our assumptions, it wasn't coming. Same with CST.
Okay, well, let's see. Oh, okay, 2 more questions. Here's really quickly here. A question, then an announcement. It's a follow-up on the capacity factor answer. What active management and DERMS assumptions are considered in the 2035 scenario?
I don't know the answer to that. So we might have that in, but that's not my area of expertise.
Okay, and I think that's it for the questions. So Jaquelin, I really appreciate you joining us.
Great, well, thanks for having me, and great questions from everyone. It's really is a delight to interact with you all, even if I can't see you.
Well, thanks again, and everyone have a great evening, and we'll hopefully catch you at our next webinar.